Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation, to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house to check one last time as a courtesy that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And, of course, for our Internet viewers, questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We will post the program on our homepage also for everyone's future reference following today's presentations. Hosting our program is Norbert Michel. Dr. Michel is our research fellow in financial regulations in the Thomas Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. He studies and writes about housing finance, including the reform of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. He also focuses on the best ways to address difficulties at large financial companies. He and I have the argument between he addressing too big to fail. I prefer to call it too big to succeed, but there's always a difference in economics. And he researches monetary policy and other issues related to the Federal Reserve. Before joining us here in 2013, he was a tenured professor at Nichols State University College of Business. He had previously served as a tax policy analyst here for us at Heritage and with the global energy company Entergy. Please join me in welcoming my colleague Norbert Michel. Norbert?
Thank you, John. And there were no Louisiana jokes that time. That was good. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all very much for joining us. We're very happy that you're here and very happy to have James Grant here. Jim is an accomplished financial journalist and historian. He is the founder and editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer, a twice-monthly journal of investment markets. He began his career in journalism in 1972 at the Baltimore Sun, and then joined the staff of Barron's in 1975, where he originated the Current Yield column. His newest book, The Forgotten Depression, 1921, The Crash That Cured Itself, provides a history of America's last governmentally unmedicated economic downturn. And that, of course, is the topic that he is going to talk about with us today. But he's written many other books as well, many good books, I would add.
Not all of them.
Well, at least one of them was really good, I know. And they're mostly finance-related and financial history-related, such as Bernard Baruch, The Adventures of a Wall Street Legend, Money of the Mind, which is the one that I can attest to. Money of the Mind was really good. Minding Mr. Market, The Trouble with Prosperity, and Mr. Market Miscalculates. He's also the author of a pair of political biographies, John Adams, Party of One, A Life of the Second President of the U.S., and Mr. Speaker, The Life and Times of Thomas B. Reed, the man who broke the filibuster. His work has been featured in countless financial publications, including the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he's appeared on more well-known television news programs than you can count, including 60 Minutes and Jim Lear's NewsHour. He also contributed an essay to the 6th edition of Graham and Dodd's Security Analysis, which, for those of you who do not have an undergraduate degree in finance, I can tell you for sure is the Bible of financial statement analysis, one of the most exciting topics that there is. Jim is a former Navy's gunner's mate. He's a Phi Beta Kappa alum at Indiana University, and he earned his master's degree in international relations from Columbia. He's a trustee of the New York Historical Society. He and his wife Patricia live in Brooklyn, and they are parents of 4 grown children. All of which is to say that he is certainly tough enough to have survived the hailstorm of criticism from the left aimed at his new book. Predictably somewhat, I think, the book was sharply criticized by some who were eager to reject the notion that an economy can recover without massive government intervention. A great deal of that criticism, interestingly, countered arguments that weren't even in the book. Jim did not argue, for example, that the 1921 event refutes, I quote, everything we've learned about macroeconomics since the 1920s. Nor did he argue that the 1921 event proves the government, including the Fed, should have done absolutely nothing in 2008, although he was accused of that as well. Nor did Jim argue that the government should institute a deliberate policy of deflation, though he was also accused of that. Some of the criticism makes you wonder, obviously, if the critics even cared to read the book. On page 2, for example, Jim openly admits that we can't know what might have been if Wilson and Harding had intervened as presidents of the late 20th and 21st centuries are wont to do. They might have just skipped ahead, I don't know. In any case, the book is an excellent set of narratives expertly woven together, and it provides a highly readable account of the history of that period. And I think that it highlights a quandary that policymakers have consistently faced in the post-World War II era. And the recent housing bubble is a perfect example of this. We instituted policies, government policies, that inflated housing prices, and then they crashed. And in the wake of the crash, policymakers have been tripping over themselves to stop prices from falling. So perhaps the real question is, what can we do to stop inflating prices in the first place? And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
All right. Thank you, Norbert. And thank you, Heritage. Is this audible? Yes? Is that good? That is it good that it's audible?
Yes.
We'll see about that. Well, my book and I are delighted to be here. The book is a work of history in length just over the decent minimum of 200 pages with, as you baseball fans know, was the kind of the authorial Mendoza line. The title says that the Depression of 1920-21 is forgotten. Well, I do hope that in future editions the publishers will be a little bit more affirmative and say that perhaps the previously forgotten Depression of 1920-21. Anyway, it's an episode that I do hope you'll remember. Now, I wrote this because in 2008, the Great Depression of the 30s monopolized the market in economic historical analogy. Policymakers, especially the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Ben Bernanke, Ph.D., invoked constantly the 1930s with reference to the crisis of the mangled mortgages and combusting banks. No intervention was too great to forestall a repeat of that calamity, they said. Thus, the drive to stimulate, to print money and to spend it and to push back deposit rates to the zero bound and beneath it, and we are still being stimulated today, 7 years after the trouble started. The Depression of 1920-21 went unmentioned. As far as I know, not a single senior policymaker invoked it on the other side of the stimulus argument. I thought it was a regrettable omission. The business cycle downturn of the early 20s was the last governmentally unmedicated slump in American history in response to plunging employment and very, very weak profits and falling prices. The successive administrations of Woodrow Wilson and Warren G. Harding did essentially nothing. That is, nothing in the way of macroeconomic intervention. Indeed, the word macroeconomic had not yet come into the Washington vocabulary. Congress balanced the budget, and the still wet behind the ears Federal Reserve raised, mind you, raised, not lowered interest rates. Prices were allowed to fall, wages too. Nobody was in charge, save Adam Smith's invisible hand. Yet, 18 months after it started, the Depression ended, after which the 1920s proverbially roared. You may say, many have said, that 1921 was a long time ago, and so it was. Then again, so was 1931. And you may observe that the world has changed since 1921, as it has since 1931. All I ask is something like parity of historical relevance between two very different cyclical events. This is contentious and politically charged, I know. So I want to be careful to separate the past from the present and history from prescription. We can delve a little, if you like, into the applicability of the historical facts about 3 o'clock when my speech will end. Oh, that's a joke. Yeah. But let's start with the facts, such as we can know them. They say that the past is a foreign country. The economic and financial past can seem especially alien. So the Great War, that is World War I, ended on November 11th, 1918. That at least is when the shooting stopped. The bills kept rolling in. The belligerent nations had fought the war on the cuff. They spent and they borrowed and they taxed and they commandeered and they printed money, just as we do today, though they actually had to round up the paper and the ink and the engravers, which presented a difficulty of logistics. We today have the iPhone. So wars are inherently inflationary. The aftermath of major war was known to be deflationary. What had followed the Napoleonic Wars and America's Civil War was deflation, falling prices, collapsing debts, hard times. Not this time, though. In 1919, the oft-predicted post-war depression was a no-show. Quite the contrary, business was booming. It was an inflationary boom set aloft by easy money and suppressed interest rates. Still, it was surprising and unscripted. Maybe it would last. Expecting that it would, people made the appropriate adjustments. Farmers planted fence post to fence post. They bought land and invested in tractors, just then displacing horses. Bankers fed a booming demand for credit. Citicorp, accident-prone even then, went rather overboard by lending in Cuba against the single crop of sugar. General Motors built itself a $20 million headquarters building, the largest such structure of its kind in the world, with 33 acres of floor space. This structure was named after the company's still living founder, Billy Durant. Harry Truman and Eddie Jacobson, back from the war, founded a men's clothing store at the northeast corner of 12th and Baltimore Streets in Kansas City, and bank loans financed the inventory. The music stopped on November 3rd, 1919. That was when the Federal Reserve Bank of New York lifted its discount rate to 4 3/4 from 4, 3/4 of 1 point. In that month, the Dow gave up no less than 12.8% of its value. Another turn of the screw in January, this time lifting the discount rate to 6%. And then came the deluge, which took the form not of a break in the stock market, but rather of a succession of bear markets in commodities. In 1929, the great thunderclap came from the corner of Broad and Wall Streets. In 1920, the trouble started in Tokyo, where the silk market failed and banks failed in the aftermath. One point of historical disagreement concerns the intensity of the downturn I describe as a depression. The eminent economist Christina Romer wrote a monograph in which she contended that really the events of 1920 and 21 were a little short of a nasty recession, but nothing worse. I contend, on the contrary, that this was something for the record books. Now, macroeconomic data, like the macroeconomy itself, was a concept yet uninvented. Data are sparse, but reportage is extensive, and some statistics do survive. Auto production from peak to trough down 23%. Number of companies reporting net income greater than $100,000, down 45%. Average disposable farm income down 57%, no small difficulty when the agricultural economy still contributed about 18% to the national income. The year 1921 was the first year since 1899 to register a decline in the physical volume of American manufacturing. This was no era of good feelings. There had been a Red Scare. The Attorney General's front door was bombed. Influenza pandemic had killed 40 million people, including 675,000 Americans. September 16th, 1920, a bomb exploded on Wall Street, killing dozens. A grand jury convened to hear evidence concerning the possible fixing of the 1919 World Series. And ladies and gentlemen, all this was born with Prohibition. Can you imagine suffering through this sober? As I say, Christina Romer, an econometrician of some renown, contends this was like nothing. However, I have a clinching item of non-econometric evidence to impart to you, and that is the hit song of 1921 was the tuneful and mordant song, Ain't We Got Fun, one of whose lyrics goes, the rich get richer and the poor get children. Get poor is also one lyric, but the one that really matters to the parents in this room is children. Okay. So mass hysteria, right? What the heck do we do? Here is the national economy. By the way, there was no such thing as the economy then, at least not something that people had conceptualized as such. When the Republicans met in 1920, you know, the word economy appeared not once except in the context of the government ought to be spending less money. Economy and government, that was the only mention of the word. So the economy didn't exactly exist except people could see that something was wrong. So what do we do about it? Well, for better or worse, the incumbent of the White House, Woodrow Wilson, was in no position to do anything. He had been struck down late in 1919 by trying to sell his League of Nations. He was felled by a stroke. He was incapacitated, so was his administration. So we call this in the book and I call this laissez-faire by accident. Now, do you remember, this is from contemporary times, but still from yesteryear, a financial secretary of the then colony of Hong Kong named later Sir John Copperthwaite. Well, Sir John Copperthwaite made his mark by his refusal to allow the collection of economic data for the thriving colony of Hong Kong, lest those data be used in the service of governmental improvement, that is, say, intervention. He felt, as perhaps some of you feel, certainly I feel, as if one runs the risk with a nonstop shower of macroeconomic data that something like statistical hypochondria is a clear and present risk. Certainly, macroeconomic interventions seem to him a clear and present danger. So there were no data really that we know of them, that we know them now to support intervention, and Woodrow Wilson was in no position to intervene. The Federal Reserve was in business, and you're perhaps wondering what it was thinking about, having raised interest rates and having at least observed, if not quantified, the collapse in commodity prices and the evident sinking of business activity. So I'm going to read you a couple of lines from the remarks of Benjamin Strong, who was the Janet Yellen of his day. He ran the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and effectively he was in charge of the entire system. And the remarks I'm going to give you are rather prescient. He uttered them before the trouble started, but he was thinking ahead. He realized that the wartime inflation had distorted the structure of production. He realized that if the price level were to return to something like normal, there would be a great deal of dislocation. And here is how effectively the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board then thought about the consequences of inflation and of the best policies to meet those consequences. So here is Benjamin Strong. He said that, yes, there was going to be trouble, but the best way to meet it, he said, was to kind of allow it to happen. He said that, yes, this is going to be accompanied by some rather serious losses because our increased prices have occurred in a country enjoying exceptional prosperity in which merchants and manufacturers have unfortunately maintained too large stocks of goods as compared with their foreign competitors. I believe this period will be accompanied by a considerable degree of unemployment, but not for very long, and that after a year or two of discomfort, embarrassment, some losses, some disorders caused by unemployment, we will emerge with an almost invincible banking position, with prices more nearly at competitive levels with other nations, and be able to exercise a wide and important influence in restoring the world to normal and livable conditions. So implicit in these remarks was the idea of a market economy in which the price level functioned and in which individuals seeking their own best outcomes would collectively, though not in any coordinated fashion, orchestrate the most expeditious end of an inflationary bubble. Strong, at least as little as one can know of anyone's true emotional state, seemed not to be a cruel man. He wasn't wishing bankruptcies and dislocation and unemployment on anyone, but he was saying that the fastest way to a new recovery, the fastest way to new prosperity was to let the price mechanism sort out the errors of the boom. I guess he believed that booms not only precede busts, but also to a degree cause them. So without actually saying so, he was summoning this thing we call the price mechanism, this idea of untrammeled, more or less uncoordinated through central command markets to do their work, and the standard of value, as the gold dollar, would remain the same, and prices and wages would adjust. These days, of course, in very, very stark contrast, it is the money supply and the level of interest rates and exchange rates in many countries that do the adjusting. So the value of money is meant to be, in the present day, is meant to be variable. And wages and prices are meant only to go up. And that is the single, among perhaps the greatest difference between that time and this. Very, very big difference indeed, of course. A couple of sightings on just how bad things were and then how things ever got better, and then I welcome a question or two. These days, I don't know how many dozens of income maintenance programs the federal government has. In those days, not one. There was a difference in society with respect to adversity. And I'm going to read to you a couple of soundings about how people thought about depressions and about suffering. So there was a federally sponsored post-mortem of the Depression, and the functionaries sent around questionnaires to companies across the country asking them what had happened to them and what they thought of the events of 1920 and 21. And this post-mortem observed that actually many were the uses of adversity. Quote, said a Columbia University sociologist, "Misfortune is not always to be appraised at face value. It drags down one person to ruin and despair. It serves another as a whetstone to point ambition and to sharpen latent powers. Unemployment, then, is sometimes good, generally bad, and is infrequently disastrous beyond repair for those concerned." Now, here is the human resources director of the American Rolling Mill, Middletown, Ohio, responding to this questionnaire about what the Depression was like for him and for his community. Quote, "Within our experience, there are no specific outstanding cases of a disaster as a result of unemployment, nor can we say that this individual or that was particularly benefited, but our general impression, gained through rather close observation, is that the moral fiber of our community was strengthened during the past 15 months. Huh? I mean, maybe his moral fiber was strengthened. But whatever we think of the sentiment, I read this to you to illustrate the difference in attitude between one generation and another, to underscore the idea that the past is indeed a foreign country. These words sound alien, though they are in good colloquial American. Now, what did it look like at the bottom? what was the American enterprise? What face did it present to the world, to investors? How do things look? I'm going to shock the investors in the room with a couple of quotations from stocks, and I'm going to quote from the head of the DuPont company about what a major industrial enterprise looked like at the bottom of the cycle, and then I will tell you in a word or two how things ever recovered from this disaster, and then we'll be off with a Q&A. First, goings-on at the DuPont company. Now, if any American business had cause to regret the armistice of November 11th, 1918, it was the world's largest maker of explosives. DuPont had a most prosperous Great War, and the peace was met, I dare say, in the state of Delaware with mixed emotions. So how did this thriving explosives and chemical maker deal with the rug being pulled out from under it? How did things work in 1921? Well, here's what DuPont did. It fired half the employees. It eliminated its bank debt. It wrote down its inventories by 1/2. It showed earnings in 1921 of $2.35 a share versus earnings in 1920 of $17 a share. So have you had enough, by the way, of the phrase new normal? Are you ready to scream if you hear it one more time? Well, yes, I'm glad to hear that because I, too, am sick and tired of it. But it's not a new concept. It's not a new query. Everyone wanted to know whether the world was embarked on a new age of, what's the phrase that Larry Summers favors? Oh, yes, secular stagnation. Is this something new and ugly and permanent? Well, here is what René DuPont, the eponym, the head of the DuPont company, had to say about the future and about the recent past. He said to his stockholders, addressing the owners of the business, the stockholders of this company are anxious to know whether this represents a new era of reduced business or whether the depression will quickly pass. And what DuPont said in response to this rhetorical question was that the DuPont company had been filling its needs for raw material out of its own stockpiles for the past year, and it had cut its orders by, say, 50%. The businesses with which DuPont was associated, its vendors, for example, had done the same. So naturally, the world had seemed to end. But DuPont held out hope that this too would pass, and that when it did, there would be an abrupt acceleration of inventory building that would perhaps ignite a very up-tempo recovery, and so it proved. It did improve. It did indeed prove to be the case. But here is how the stock market looked at rock bottom in 1921. For you investors, I hope you are gripping the arms of your chairs because this is either very tempting to you if you're one value-minded turn, if you're a value-minded turn, or it could be terrifying if you. In any case, here are the facts. The stock market was basically sawed in half, top to bottom. But without government management, prices fell low enough to entice value-seeking investors from all parts of the world to come back and to avail themselves of commanding bargains. CocaCola, then a new and seemingly promising growth stock, at the bottom was priced at less than 2 times what it would earn per share in 1922. And the dividend was 5.25%. Gillette Safety Razor Company, which had sold as many razors and blades in 1921 as it had in 1920, as it had in 1919, had a very good depression. It was at 5 times immediately forward earnings, and it yielded more than 9%. RCA, Radio Company of America, not yet revealed as the growth stock of the age, was trading at exactly what it would earn in 1923, $1.50. So here we are. We're at the bottom of the cycle. The government has done nothing except to make things worse. We have a new Republican administration that's no more mindful of economic data, which didn't exist and was its predecessor. Why are we not still in this depression, Paul Krugman? Why did it ever end? Well, the answer that my book and I vouchsafe to you is that not only did prices fall, but also wages fell. And along about the bottom, there was a coordination through market means of prices and wages such that employers found it worthwhile to produce and to hire. Asset prices plunged, not just stocks, but also real estate, also bond prices. Money was mobile. Gold came in and out of the country freely. America was the last country on a virtual gold standard, not quite pure in the 19th century sense, but a pretty good first approximation of a pure gold standard. So gold freely entered the country and expanded the money supply or the monetary base in a way the Fed had chosen not to do. So individuals acting without central coordination came to a view that things were, after all, not so bad, and indeed, in some respects, quite promising. Now, the government didn't literally do nothing. That is, the Republican administration didn't literally do nothing. It helped to instill a sense of optimism and of possibility for the future. The president's view, Warren G. Harding thought that the budget ought to be balanced, that the government ought to allow business to thrive, and that the clamor for redistribution of income in the shape of a bonus to the veterans of World War I, that ought not to pass Congress. And he expended a great deal of political capital to make sure that did not pass. He went to the Senate personally and argued against it, did President Harding. Harding, in addition, sponsored a global disarmament conference. He wanted peace and prosperity through enterprise. That was the program. He had a Treasury Secretary named Andrew W. Mellon, one of the nation's foremost industrialists and bankers and financiers, who, in response to a Federal Reserve observation that there being a little speculation suddenly, said, well, the country can use some speculation. And under Mellon's influence, the Fed began to lower interest rates in 1921, a little. With the combination of market forces, of constructive government action, of the hope born of constructive inaction, all these things, say the book and I, all these things came together. And along about the autumn of 1921, there were reported labor shortages in Detroit. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, had said about this time, I guess in the early 20s, the more troublesome the times, the worse does a laissez-faire system work. And that has become writ. We see variations on this theme. We read them, we hear them. I submit to you that the historical example of 1921 serves, insofar as the doctrine can be refuted through example, serves indeed to refute it. So, Norbert, that's my speech. And thank you for listening to me.
And we can do question and answers, and then afterwards, after a little while, Jim has graciously agreed to sign a book if you have a book, and then we'll be done. So we have a microphone coming around. If anybody has any questions, if you just please state your name and affiliation, and we'll find you. So if anybody have anything? Nothing?
That's pretty self-explanatory, I thought.
Yeah. Jim's very thorough, so. We have one behind you.
I'm Diane Katz with Heritage. You know, I noticed such a difference with the stock market now as opposed to what you're describing. And I'd be interested to hear your explanation as to why we seem to have such an exuberant, or at least relatively exuberant stock market compared to, the period that you're discussing.
Yes, the question concerns the stock market and the values therein, or lack of values therein, at low market ebbs these days compared to what was on offer in 1921. Well, the new thing about our finance is not so much the level of interest rates, although I dare say that the negative mortgage rate observed in Denmark 2 days ago was something new under the sun. The bank pays you. That's new. But interest rates were also very low in Victorian times. Walter Bagehot, the editor of The Economist, famously admonished the central bank, or famously warned his fellow financial people that people with financial interests that they said John Bull can say anything, but he can't stand 2%. Meaning positive 2%, but still so low interest rates pertained in the 19th century, they pertained in 1946, they pertain today. What is new today, especially, even newer than low rates, is the government-administered program of asset price levitation. That is new. That is unprecedented as far as my reading of history goes. So Chairman Bernanke in 2009, perhaps, or 2010, was on CNBC or some such, and he pointed with a certain proprietary interest to the rise in the Russell small cap index, the Russell 2000. That was most undignified. He should have mentioned the Dow or something, some blue chip. The Federal Reserve Board's slumming with small caps I thought was most unbecoming. But this is something new. So in 1946, there were low rates and there were low stock prices. The Federal Reserve raised margin requirements to like 100%. Mariner Eccles said, we've seen speculation before. The central banks of yore presiding over low rates had nothing to do with managing stock prices. The Swiss National Bank, when it was in the business of suppressing the rise in the Swiss franc, now try to follow the bouncing ball. The Swiss National Bank would buy euros, and with for nothing, right? Because it cost nothing to produce Swiss francs on the digital press. So it would buy euros, and with those euros, it would buy dollars, and with those dollars, it bought American common stocks, $27 billion worth of American equities, with nothing. Now that is a new thing under the sun. They say there ain't no free lunch. What's freer than free? Ah, yes, that. So you ask, what's changed? Well, the fingerprints of the central banks are all over the asset markets. In effect, so money has been turned it's no longer a store of value. Money is an instrument of national macroeconomic policy. That is a little bit new too. But the specific new thing, relating to your question, is asset prices. And when central banks push them, they tend not to go down so much.
Alex Pollock of the American Enterprise Institute. Jim, great talk as always. Thank you.
Alex is such a ringer. He kindly sponsored a reading of this book, Brand X, but thank you.
Well, thinking about reading it, you mentioned in your talk the difference between the 20s experience and the 30s and all of the lessons that we hear so much about the 30s. But you discuss in the book another set of lessons, which is the late 20s and early 30s under Hoover and what was tried, which doesn't get into the common parlance about lessons of the 30s. But I thought in the book there's some quite interesting things. You want to say a word or two about the experiences of Hoover's attempted macroeconomic management?
Yes. Well, Herbert Hoover was the least suited president ever to implement a policy of laissez-faire. He was hyperactive. He was when he was the Secretary of Commerce under President Harding, he was said to be the Secretary of Commerce and the Assistant Secretary of everything else. He was a humanitarian par excellence. He was a mining engineer in the day. He was a great gatherer up of data, was Hoover. He expanded the survey of current business. He invented it, and starting out with like 3 series of data. By 1929, it was a compendium, very, very modern-looking document. Now, Hoover had a front row seat on the 1921 Depression. He was Secretary of Commerce, and he organized a federal conference on unemployment, which, in the way of such things, took place after the Depression ended. So fast forward at 8 years, Hoover came into office in 1929 and presided for a time over apparently the greatest manifestation of wealth, ingenuity, and enterprise the world had ever seen. The American economy in 1929 was a thing to behold. Come the crash, there was an obvious deflationary undertow. There was be a recession, certainly. What to do about it? Well, Hoover, being constitutionally incapable of doing nothing, chose to do something. And what he chose to do was to summon the industrialists, the great industrialists of America, to the White House for a series of conferences, the gravamen of which was that no socially conscious businessman would cut wages. There was a kind of an element of noblesse oblige in this. Hoover said that the capital ought to wear the losses, not labor. So they lined up to make these pledges. Henry Ford went out and actually raised the wages of the employees of the Ford Motor Company in the aftermath of this, upstaging the president. An economist, I think at UCLA, Lee Ohanian, has done some, I find some very impressive econometric work on the wage question, and concludes that it was the rigidity of wages in 1929, 30, and 31 that sunk the American economy. That, of course, if prices are falling, as they did, and if wages don't fall, profit-seeking entrepreneurs are going to hire a few people or none or something, but they can't keep going with the full wage bill. So, you think, looking back on it, we have this depression lasted a year and a half, and what followed was something wonderful. And we had the Great Depression, which lasted formally, between September of 1929 and March of 33 or something, but really kept going until the end of World War II. And knowing what we know, you would think perhaps that someone would have said, let us learn from what is, after all, not such a bad cyclical experience, not intervene, and we'll be over and done with, and we can get on to the American business of dynamism and growth. But no, that was not the lesson learned. The lesson learned from Hoover, the lesson that Hoover took away, was to not go through this again. And you can read this in the contemporary press, the New York Times, Citibank. Of course, Citibank would say these things. Let us not be so muddle-headed as to suffer as we suffered in 1921. Let us intervene constructively to prop up wages and make sure. So what followed was catastrophe. Now, this is a contentious piece. I can't pretend that my own research adds much to it, but I was most taken by the research of Lee Ohanian, and also by a school of thought that held that something was wrong in the 20s with respect to prices, that the Federal Reserve Board had had enough of 1921. They, too, had taken perhaps the wrong lesson. They organized monetary policy in such a way as to prevent the price level from sagging. Now, in a time of enterprise and technological wonder and of falling production costs, I mean, why shouldn't prices fall? Why shouldn't they dwindle as they had in the final quarter of the 19th century? And if through means of monetary stimulus, prices don't decline in the face of falling costs, doesn't that mean there's some inflation? Doesn't that mean that there is an increment of ether or of air or of inflationary whipped cream somewhere that's going to come to a mischievous end? Well, that's my working hypothesis on the monetary end of things in the 20s. Prices should have dwindled as a kind of a dividend to working people who could buy more with the dollars they took home, but prices did not dwindle. They more or less stable. Murray Rothbard argues this very persuasively, it seems to me, in his book, The America's Great Depression. So, Alex, you asked for a couple of lessons having to do with late 20s and early 30s. So I would say that one has to do with the subtle risk of imposing stable prices. It's a very nuanced argument, but I find it very persuasive. And the second lesson, either learned or unlearned, is that if prices fall, then wages had better keep up, lest there be mass unemployment.
Yeah, hi there. I've been a fan of yours since the current yield days. Tom Wilbur, just a
thank you,
member,
Tom.
Heritage, yeah. And anyway, but I haven't read the book yet.
What?
But on a happier note than Hoover, the era is known for the melon tax cuts that started under Harding and proceeded into Coolidge. Did those have any effect on the recovery?
No,
Did that come too late? Or?
there was the prospect of lower taxes. Mellon certainly pushed for them, but he did not get what he wanted initially. And activity made its lows well before the sighting of those future policies.
All right. So it's more the prospect of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the prospect the prospect was what happened under Reagan. The first 8, 10, 12 months of the Reagan administration were very disappointing in substance, but there was the prospect of something great. And that's what it seems to me, that's the expectations are a very, very potent force in markets. Yes, Ralph Benkel.
Hello, Jim Grant, wonderful book, as you might be able to infer from my review of it in Forbes.com. There's one particularly important nuance, and that was your addressing the shift by the monetary authorities toward the prescription of Keynes and Fisher to price stability, which is often spoken of as one of the virtues of the gold standard, but that's point-to-point price stability over time. This looks like they're targeting CPI or PPI or some other kind of, some other kind of real-time price stability. That is a historic shift, and it's under-discussed because the statutory franchise of the Fed now is price stability and job creation. Yeah. So that strikes me as a historic inflection point, which you addressed, but I think there's a lot more that could be said about that because that might be where the world turned.
Yeah, maybe. The idea that prices ought to be stable, they ought not to have to adjust, that the standard of value ought to adjust sensibly in the face of shifting business conditions. This idea had been around for 100 years. There was a British radical called Thomas Atkinson, who, 1785 to 1850 was his dates approximately. And Atkinson was a Birmingham banker and industrialist. And he gave really, really potent and modern-sounding speeches against the restoration of the gold pound sterling after the Napoleonic Wars. He stood up in 1819, 1820 and said, we need more currency. We can't go back to gold. It's going to be a deflation, and people are going to suffer. And there was a deflation, and people did suffer. However, the 100 years between the great post-Napoleonic peace and the onset of the Great War were the 100 most prosperous years in the history of Britain and indeed arguably of the world. So this idea of price stability is one of the great chestnuts of economic thought. I mean, it's just been around forever. And if you read the ancients on this, what I've come to see is that nothing has changed except the quality of debate has gotten lousier. I mean, you read the speeches 200 years ago, wow. And now, read the op-ed page of the FT, whatever, you know. So I'm not sure there's going to be ever a resolution to this. In fact, I'm quite sure there's not going to be a resolution based upon 1,000 years of argument.
I'll throw in too. This price issue. This is really the crux of all sort of macroeconomic issues right now, or in the postmodern era, the post-war era. In this idea that we can't let prices fall. I mean, this really is the source of a lot of issues in macroeconomics. I would direct people interested into two places. One would be George Selgin's Less Than Zero, which is readable by people who are not technical, and it reminds me of something that I saw Jim say on an interview once, which is that the Fed is essentially aligning itself against the Walmart business model. In other words, we won't let prices fall. And people should start to question this, because you should just think of this in your own terms, which is, of course I would like to pay lower prices. So ask yourselves, why is that a problem? And if you want to go a little bit more technical, there's an American Economic Review article from 2004, and you can skip through the technical part, but this is far from an obscure journal. This is the top, supposedly the top economics journal in the world. It's a piece by Atkinson and Kehoe, and they do a cross-country study for as many years as they can get data, and it shows that with the exception of our Great Depression, there are almost no instances of falling prices being associated with depression, and in fact, there are many eras of falling prices associated with robust economic growth. Now, that's the opposite of what the policy prescription in the Federal Reserve has been basically since World War II.
You know, prices, as measured by the CPI, fell for 12 consecutive months between 1954 and 55, and they fell for like 6 or 8 months consecutively in the early 60s at one point. And the thing about the 1955 experiment, I guess people were too busy watching the Brooklyn Dodgers, my team, win the World Series. Distracted they were. But nobody said nothing about deflation. You go through the newspapers and the records, it was kind of a non-event. Now there's this kind of statistical hypochondria about falling prices, and it's important to ask also, I mean, how accurate are these measures how accurate are the indices? It is no small thing to compile an index of prices. You have to go decide which goods and services to pick. You have to, adjust them for quality. Now, that's you ever go on the road and you forget a toothbrush? I did the other day, and so the next morning I go downstairs and say to the concierge, "Oh, toothbrush." And I got this toothbrush. It was just no battery inside. You put it in your mouth, it's like dead. Okay, so a spin brush, after you use it, you feel like you've been to the hygienist. It's a great product. That costs about $10. Now, the brush that feels like nothing costs about 50 cents. So what's the price? How much has the price of a toothbrush gone up? I paid $20 for a spin brush that morning. So the compilation of indices with respect to product price and quality and selection and accuracy of sampling, these things are highly technical and difficult. So you read in the papers that Mario Draghi, yes, is going to create $1 trillion worth of euros to forestall the calamity of a CPI coming in at less than 0.2%. Please, what is the margin for statistical error in the sampling of these indices? I mean, this is really something. But he goes beyond that, does Draghi. He says, yes, I'm anxiously watching the five-year forward swaps rate on inflation. Do you have any idea what he's talking about? Well, I can tell you, he's looking at the market-imputed rate of inflation beginning in 5 years' time. So the 5 years starting in 2019. That's what the president of the European Central Bank is watching. He is watching a will-o'-the-wisp. Okay, here's a little historical mind game. Ladies and gentlemen, the year is 1914. The time is springtime. We are in Germany. No Great War yet. In fact, the world is rather perfect. The mark is not only as good as it is gold. We are sitting around the directors' table because we are fellow directors of this eminent German bank, and the chairman, to provoke a little discussion, asks us to weigh in on our guesses for the rate of inflation, ladies and gentlemen only. Yes, sorry. Gentlemen, the rate of inflation 5 years from now. Let's pick a, let's see, 1923. And here's what nobody says. Herr Chairman, is what nobody says. There will be a great war. Germany will be shattered. The world will never be the same. There will be pandemic of influenza. There will be the destruction, really, of everything we know and love. The German price index, now on an index level at 1, will rise. The mark will become worthless, and then really worthless. The index will rise from 1 to 218,000 million. That's what nobody said, but that's what happened. So you do wonder about the foresight of human beings. I mean, the thing about policy, about these monetary policy makers, is they pretend to know. Now, we New Yorkers are a little humbler in the face of the financial future after the blizzard that wasn't. There was a blizzard to be, you root for snow or again? I root for snow. I love blizzards. And I was transported really to hear on a Friday that there's going to be the greatest blizzard in the history of the city of New York. It goes back like 350 years. Okay, that was Friday. Wait a second. I thought they had 10-day forecast. This is for Tuesday. Friday for Tuesday. Wait a second. I thought they had 10-day forecast. No, this just popped up. Okay, that's a surprise. That's good. And as late as Monday, at about 8 p.m., the blizzard was still forecast to be the greatest blizzard ever, and then suddenly it was kind of never mind. Now, the significance of this for finance is that snowflakes do not read the papers, don't surf the web, don't change their minds because of something they saw on CNBC. They are inanimate forces of nature. And we can't forecast them really. A little bit we can, but not the disasters or the opportunities for snow days. We can't really do that all the time. And yet we, in our conceit, contend that we can forecast the actions of willful and contrary-minded and ever-interesting human beings en masse. It defies, to me, it defies belief, and I can so Norbert has given you a couple of bibliographic items. I will submit another one for you, and this is the name of this book is On the Accuracy of Economic Observations, and the author is Oscar Morgenstern. Came out around 1950 with subsequent editions. And this is a lacerating dissection of the pretense of macroeconomic data gathering, and an especially juicy condemnation of the press for its credulity in reporting these numbers that are very difficult, very questionable, and without any margin for error. Okay, CPI is going to be CPI was 1.2%. Yeah, plus or minus what, like 5 percentage points? So, whatever the question was, that's the answer.
Okay, I think if we do have time for one more, if we have one. If not, we can adjourn, but I think we're good. Okay, thank you guys very much for coming.